The humidity of an Atlanta July clung to the windows of the Haven like a damp wool blanket, but inside, the air smelled of floor wax, roasted coffee, and the faint, sweet scent of Diane's lavender perfume. Diane stood at the tall oak counter of the community center, her hands moving with a practiced rhythmic grace as she folded flyers for the upcoming literacy drive. At 55, she possessed a beauty that was less about youth and more about a soul well lived. Fine lines at the corners of her eyes that spoke of laughter, and a posture that remained unbowed despite the weight she carried. The bell above the door chimed. It wasn't a neighbor looking for a hot meal or a student seeking a quiet place to study. It was a man in a charcoal gray suit that cost more than the center's annual utility budget. He didn't speak. He simply placed a thick, cream-colored envelope on the counter and walked away. Diane's heart did a slow, painful roll in her chest. She didn't need to open it. The logo in the corner, a stylized interlocking K and D, was the brand of her nightmare, Kang Day Global. She retreated to her small back office, a sanctuary filled with mismatched bookshelves and a single framed photograph of her son, Julian, in his graduation robes. With trembling fingers, she broke the seal. Final notice of eviction. Vacate within 30 days. The words blurred. The Haven was more than a building. It was the promise she had made to herself and God 30 years ago when she returned from Korea with nothing but a broken heart and a life growing inside her. It was where she had raised Julian as a single mother. It was the place where she had buried her own grief to plant seeds of hope for others. She sank into her chair, the silence of the office pressing in on her. She had fought the city council, she had fought the developers, but this faceless conglomerate from across the ocean was a titan she couldn't reach. Diane closed her eyes. She didn't cry out. She didn't rail against the ceiling. She simply leaned her head back and whispered into the quiet, "I'm at the end of my strength, Father. I've built this for your people. If this is where the road ends, show me. But if it isn't, I need a miracle. I need you to move the mountain." Seoul, South Korea. 12 time zones away, Han Dae-seong stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse office, watching the neon pulse of Seoul. At 56, he was the picture of Chaebol perfection. Tall, silver-templed, with an aura of cold, untouchable power. His life was a masterpiece of obsidian and glass, a temple to the empire he had spent 3 decades building. But inside, the temple was hollow. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. His assistant entered, bowing low. "Chairman Han, the board is frustrated. The Atlanta acquisition is stalled. The difficult tenant at the center of the development site is refusing the buyout. Your mother, the chairwoman, is demanding you authorize the forced demolition." Dae-seong didn't turn around. The mention of his mother brought a familiar, bitter taste to his mouth. For 30 years, he had been the dutiful son. He had married the woman she chose, divorced her when the merger was complete, and expanded the company until it choked the sky. He had everything, 10 times the wealth of his father, and yet he often felt like a ghost haunting his own life. "Who is this tenant?" Dae-seong asked, his voice a low melodic baritone that commanded the room. "A woman, sir, runs a community center. She has no political backing, no significant funds, just persistence." Dae-seong felt a strange, inexplicable flicker of curiosity. He was weary of the board meetings, weary of his mother's sharp tongue, and weary of the sterile luxury of Seoul. He needed to feel the sun on his face, even if it was to bury someone's dream. "Cancel my schedule for the week," Dae-seong said, finally turning. His eyes were hard, reflecting the cold lights of the city. "I will handle the Atlanta project personally. It's time to see what kind of woman thinks she can stand in the way of Kang Day Global." The humidity of Georgia usually slowed the world down, but inside the Haven, the pace was frantic. Diane was helping a young mother fill out scholarship forms when the air in the room suddenly shifted. It wasn't a draft. It was a heavy, pressurized change in the atmosphere that usually preceded a storm. The front door opened. The chime didn't just ring. It sounded like a warning. Dae-Xiong stepped over the threshold, his Italian leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the scuffed linoleum. He had spent the car ride from the airport rehearsing his negotiation. He had expected a stubborn activist, perhaps a woman looking for a larger payout to settle her debts. He was prepared to be cold, efficient, and final. Then he saw her. Diane was standing behind the counter, reaching for a pen. She froze. The light from the afternoon sun filtered through the dusty window, catching the silver in her hair. Hair that had once been dark and wild when it blew across his face in the autumn winds of Seoul. The world didn't just stop. It shattered. Dae-Xiong felt the air leave his lungs as if he'd been struck. The woman before him wasn't just a difficult tenant. She was the woman he had buried in the deepest cellar of his heart 30 years ago. The woman he had been told had taken money to disappear. The woman whose laughter had been the only music in his life before duty silenced it. Diane, he whispered. The name felt like a prayer and a confession all at once. Diane's face was a mask of marble. To an outsider, she looked perfectly composed, the epitome of the graceful community leader. But behind her back, her fingers were locked in a white-knuckled grip, her hands trembling so violently she had to press them against the shelf behind her to keep him from seeing. "Mr. Han," she said. Her voice was steady, but it was the cold steadiness of a frozen lake. "I assume you are here to tell me when the bulldozers arrive?" Dae-Xiong flinched. The chairman, who had just intimidated a board of directors an ocean away, was gone. In his place stood a man who realized, with a sickening jolt, that the mountain she had been praying against was him. I didn't know," he stammered, his polished English momentarily failing him. "I didn't know it was you." "Would it have mattered?" Diane asked, her eyes searching his. There was no anger in her gaze. That would have been easier to handle. There was only a profound, weary sadness. "You are the face of Kang Dae Global. You are the man who signs the papers that destroy lives for the sake of a high-rise. My prayers were for a miracle, Dae-Xiong. I didn't realize they were being sent to you." He wanted to reach out. He wanted to tell her that he had never forgotten her. But the sight of the eviction notice, his company's logo, sitting on her desk like a weapon made him feel like a monster. "I have a meeting," she said softly, turning her back to him to attend to the young mother who was watching them with confusion. "Please leave, Mr. Han. There is nothing left for us to discuss that hasn't already been said by your lawyers." The St. Regis Hotel, Atlanta. The presidential suite was a palace of marble and silk, but to Dae-Xiong it felt like a tomb. He stood on the balcony, the city lights of Atlanta sprawling before him, but all he could see was the way Diane's hands had shaken when she thought he wasn't looking. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, but his hand was unsteady. 30 years. He thought of the life he had lived, the sterile marriage, the endless pursuit of more, the hollow victories. He had convinced himself that he had sacrificed his happiness for the greater good of his family's legacy. But seeing Diane in that vibrant, humble center, surrounded by people who loved her, he realized that he was the one who was poor. He had come here to take her building, but he was the one who was bankrupt. He pulled a small, worn leather wallet from his pocket. Tucked behind his credit cards was a scrap of a photograph he had kept for 3 decades. Diane, laughing in a park in Seoul, her Fulbright ID badge pinned to her coat. "What have I done?" he whispered into the night. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't just the man who had lost her. He was now the villain she was praying to be saved from. And the worst part? He didn't know if he had the power to stop the machine he had spent his life building. As he closed his eyes, he saw the way she looked at him. With grace, but without an ounce of the love he had once seen there. He had to find a way back, not for the project, but for his soul. The heat of soul in 1996 was a living thing, thick with the scent of roasted chestnuts, diesel exhaust, and the electric hum of a city racing toward the millennium. For Diane, a 24-year-old Fulbright scholar from Atlanta, it was a world of neon and ancient stone, a place where she felt like a ghost until she met the man who made her feel seen. They had met in the quiet corner of a university library. He was hiding from his bodyguards. She was hiding from a research paper. Dae-seong, with his leather jacket and eyes that looked perpetually weary of the world, hadn't looked like a prince. He had looked like a man starving for a conversation that didn't involve stock options. "You're reading Yeats," he had said, his voice a low vibration in the silence of the stacks. "I'm translating him into Korean," she'd replied, not looking up, "though I think some things are meant to be felt, not translated." He had sat across from her then, and for the next 3 months, the rest of the world ceased to exist. Their soul was a secret map of midnight walks along the Han River and hidden pojangmatcha, street stalls where they shared spicy rice cakes and dreams of a life that didn't belong to the Han dynasty. Dae-seong was the rebel heir, a man who hated the gilded cage of Kangdae Global. Diane was his oxygen. "I'll leave it all, Diane," he had whispered one rain-slick night in a tiny apartment in Sinchon. He had held her hand as if it were a lifeline. "My mother can have the company. I just want the morning with you." Diane had believed him. She had given him her heart, her trust, and her body, believing that love was a force stronger than legacy. The dream shattered on a Tuesday. Diane was summoned to a private tea room in the Shilla Hotel. She expected a nervous Dae-seong. She found his mother, Chairwoman Kang. The older woman sat like a deity carved from ice, her hanbok perfectly pressed, her gaze capable of freezing blood. "You are a lovely distraction, Miss Miller," the chairwoman said, her voice like silk over a blade. "But my son has a role to play. He signed his marriage contract this morning, a merger with the Shinsegae Group. It is done." Diane felt the air turn to glass in her lungs. "He wouldn't. He told me." "He told you what a young man tells a woman when he wants to forget his chores," the chairwoman interrupted. She slid a thick, white envelope across the table. "This is for your research. Consider it a thank you from the Han family for keeping him entertained. Leave tonight. If you attempt to contact him, his father will ensure your visa is revoked and your reputation in academia is erased. Don't make me be unkind." Diane didn't touch the money. She stood up, her dignity the only thing she had left, and walked out into the Seoul rain. She called Dae-seong's private line 10 times. He never answered. She didn't know that his mother had already confiscated his phone and locked him in the family estate. 2 hours later, Chairwoman Kang stood in her son's study. Dae-seong was frantic, pacing like a caged animal. "She's gone, Dae-seong," his mother said, her voice dripping with feigned pity. "She wouldn't leave without saying goodbye," he roared. "She didn't leave empty-handed." The chairwoman threw a forged receipt onto the desk, a document showing a massive wire transfer to Diane Miller's account in the U.S. She asked for more, but I told her that was the price of a scholar's silence. She was very pragmatic once she saw the zeros, my son. She never loved you. She loved the chairman you were going to become. Dae-seong stared at the paper. The world turned gray. The woman who had talked about Yeats and feeling, not translating, had put a price on his soul. The light in his eyes went out that night, replaced by a cold, hard iron that would define the next 30 years. Atlanta, Georgia. 1 month later. Diane sat on the floor of her mother's bathroom, staring at a plastic stick. 2 pink lines. She was back in the U.S., her heart a jagged ruin. She had waited for a letter, a call, a sign that the chairwoman had lied, that he hadn't really signed that marriage contract. But the news had reached the international papers. Han Seong to wed Choi Sun-hee. The betrayal was total. He had married for power and paid her off to clear his conscience. She looked at her reflection in the mirror, her hand instinctively touching her stomach. "It's just us now," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I will never tell him. I will never let him buy you." She had spent the next 3 decades building a life out of that wreckage. She had raised Julian to be a man of honor, a man who spoke for those who had no voice. She had never married, her heart too scarred to ever fully open again, especially after a brief, failed attempt in her 40s reminded her that no one could fill the space Dae-seong had hollowed out. She had survived. She had found peace in her faith and her community. Until today. Until the man who bought her silence walked back into her life to take the only home she had left. The conference room of the Haven was usually reserved for ESL classes and AA meetings, smelling of stale powdered donuts and hope. Today, it felt like a courtroom. Dae-seong sat at the head of the scarred folding table, flanked by 2 junior attorneys who looked like they had been carved out of gray marble. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Diane's face. The way she had looked at him, not as a long-lost love, but as a predatory shadow. "The demolition schedule is non-negotiable, Mr. Han," one of his lawyers whispered. "If we don't break ground by the 15th, the city incentives expire." Dae-seong didn't answer. He was staring at the door. It swung open with a bang that made the junior attorneys flinch. A young man strode in, his presence so combustible it seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. He was 29, dressed in a slim-fit navy suit that screamed, "I'm here to win," carrying a battered leather briefcase. "Sorry I'm late," the young man said, his voice a rich, resonant baritone that echoed in the small space. "The traffic on I-20 is almost as predatory as your corporate filing." Diane, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, let out a breath she'd been holding. "Julian." The young man didn't look at his mother yet. He walked straight to the table, ignoring the offered hands of the corporate lawyers, and sat directly across from Dae-seong. Up close, his features were a striking blend. The soulful, almond-shaped eyes of the East, paired with the strong, high cheekbones and warm, deep complexion of his mother's heritage. "Julian Miller," he said, clicking a heavy silver pin, "lead counsel for the Haven, and since we're being personal enough to harass my mother at her place of work, let's be clear. I'm the man who's going to make this acquisition a living hell for Kang Dai Global." Dae-seong felt a strange electric hum in his chest. He looked at Julian. Really looked at him. The young man was reading through the latest injunction with a ferocity that was hauntingly familiar. Then Julian paused. He reached up, hooking his thumb under his jaw and rubbing the side of his chin with his forefinger. A slow, rhythmic motion as he processed the legal text. Simultaneously, his left hand began to tap the pen against the table. Tap, tap. Pause. Tap. Dae-seong's blood went cold. It was his own habit. A specific, idiosyncratic tick he had used in boardrooms for 30 years when he was calculating a killing blow. The rhythm was exact. The chin rub was identical. Dae-seong felt a bead of sweat prickle at his hairline. "The zoning laws in this district are quite specific about community heritage sites, Mr. Han," Julian said, his eyes snapping up from the paper to lock onto Dae-seong's. "You can't just buy your way through a legacy." Julian leaned forward, his sleeve pulling back to reveal his watch. Dae-seong stopped breathing. It wasn't a modern Rolex or a sleek Patek Philippe. It was a vintage 1960s Omega Seamaster with a distinctive faded leather strap and a tiny star-shaped scratch on the crystal near the 4 o'clock mark. It was the watch Dae-seong had taken off his own wrist and pressed into Diane's palm on their last night in Seoul. "This belonged to my grandfather," he had told her. It's the only thing I own that the company didn't buy. Keep it. It's my heart. I'll come for it soon." He had been told she sold it. He had been told she took the payoff and threw his heart in the trash. "That watch," Daeshong said, his voice cracking. The corporate lawyers looked at their boss in shock. They had never heard him sound so fragile. Julian glanced down at his wrist, his expression softening for a fraction of a second. "It was a gift to my mother, from a friend she lost a long time ago. She gave it to me when I passed the bar. She said it was for a man who needed to keep track of his own time, so he wouldn't waste it on the wrong things." Julian's gaze sharpened again, the heat returning to his eyes. "But we aren't here to discuss horology, are we? We're here to discuss why you think you have the right to tear down this woman's life." Daeshong looked at Diane. She was watching him from the corner, her expression unreadable, but her eyes were brimming with a terrifying protective fire. She saw the realization dawning on his face. She saw him looking at the watch, then at Julian's chin, then into Julian's eyes. She didn't look away. She didn't offer him a lifeline. In that moment, the ghost in the room became a living, breathing reality. The 29-year-old lying across the table wasn't just a lawyer. He was the son Daeshong had never known existed. He was the research payoff he thought Diane had taken. He was 30 years of lies manifested in a Navy suit. Daeshong stood up abruptly, his chair screeching against the floor. "Mr. Han?" his lawyer asked, confused. "We haven't finished the rebuttal." "I need air," Daeshong choked out. He didn't look back as he stumbled out of the room, leaving the lion and the lamb behind. He had come to Atlanta to destroy a building, but he had just discovered that he had spent 3 decades destroying himself. The rain had finally arrived, a rhythmic drumming on the tin roof of the Haven that sounded like an army of ghosts. Diane was alone, locking the heavy front doors, when she saw the silhouette of a man standing under the street lamp. He wasn't moving. He didn't even have an umbrella. She knew who it was. She could recognize the tilt of his head even in pitch darkness. She opened the door. "You'll catch pneumonia, Daeshong. At 56, you aren't a boy anymore." He stepped into the yellow light of the foyer, his expensive wool coat drenched. His eyes were bloodshot, the cold mask of the chairman having cracked and fallen away during his walk through the Georgia rain. "How old is he?" Daeshong asked. His voice was a raw, jagged thing. Diane didn't pretend not to understand. She stood behind the counter, the same place she had stood for 25 years, her sanctuary and her shield. "He is 29. He was born in April, a spring baby." Daeshong leaned against the wall, his knees nearly buckling. 29. You left Seoul in the summer of 96? You were already carrying him, and you never said a word. You took the money, and you disappeared with my son. Diane's eyes flashed, a sudden, violent spark of lightning. "The money? Is that what you still tell yourself to sleep at night?" She walked around the counter, her steps deliberate. "I never saw a cent of your family's blood money, Daeshong. Your mother offered it, and I walked out. I worked 3 jobs to pay for Julian's daycare. I slept on a mattress on the floor so he could have a bed. He is mine, not yours, not Kang Day Global's. Mine." Daeshong stared at her, the truth hitting him with the force of a physical blow. The forged receipt, the payoff his mother had shown him. It had all been a play, a meticulously crafted lie to ensure he would never look back. "I was told," he began, but the words died in his throat. What did it matter what he was told? He had believed it. He had chosen the empire over the woman. "He has my hands, Diane. He has the way I think." "He has your brain," Diane said softly, her anger cooling into a sharp, icy pity. "But he has my heart. And right now, his brain is focused on destroying you. If you have any mercy left in you, leave. Go back to your towers and your boards. Leave us our small corner of the world." I can't, he whispered. Seoul, South Korea. The video screen in the Kangdae boardroom flickered to life. Chairwoman Kang sat at the head of the table, her face a mask of terrifying composure. Dae-seong, she said, her voice echoing through the speaker in his Atlanta hotel room. Why have the demolition crews not been dispatched? The city council is asking questions. The stock is reacting to the delay. Dae-seong sat in the shadows of his suite, a laptop open before him. There are environmental complications, Mother. An old lead pipe system we didn't account for. If we dig now, the EPA will shut us down for years. Then fix it, she snapped. I did not send my son to Georgia to play at being a geologist. Flatten that building by Monday, or I will send Director Park to do it for you. The call ended with a sharp click. Da-seong looked at the screen. For the first time in his life, the fear of his mother was eclipsed by a different kind of terror. The thought of Julian looking at him and seeing only an enemy. He began to type. He didn't call the contractors. Instead, he accessed the internal project servers. With the precision of a surgeon, he began to lose digital permits. He flagged his own project for a fictitious historical preservation audit. He diverted the funds meant for the demolition into a dormant escrow account in Singapore. He was a wolf tearing at his own throat. He was sabotaging his own legacy to buy a week, a day, an hour of grace. Every time he hit enter, he thought of Julian's chin-rubbing habit. Every time he deleted a file, he thought of the Omega watch on the boy's wrist. He was the chairman of a global empire, but as he sat in the dark, watching the progress bars crawl across his screen, he felt like the rebel he had been in 1996. He was finally fighting for her, even if she didn't know it, and even if it cost him everything he had spent 30 years becoming. Diane sat at the small wooden table, a cup of herbal tea cooling between her hands. Julian stood by the window, the moonlight catching the silver of the Omega watch on his wrist. The watch he had worn as a badge of honor, thinking it was from a nameless friend. You've been quiet since the meeting, Ma, Julian said, his voice low. He didn't turn around. And that man, he didn't look at you like a landlord looks at a tenant. He looked at you like he was seeing a ghost, and he looked at me like he was looking in a mirror. Diane felt the air thicken. She had spent 29 years preparing for this, yet she felt completely unready. Julian, sit down. Julian turned, his sharp eyes softened by a vulnerability he only showed her. He sat. Is he the one? The one who bought his way out of our lives? He didn't know, Diane whispered, the truth finally breaking free. I didn't know I was pregnant. I found out about the pregnancy after I left Seoul. I was young and hurt. I didn't take a penny of his money if I couldn't have his heart. Julian rubbed his chin, that same rhythmic habit. So, the friend who gave you the watch was Han Dae-seong, Diane finished. He is your father, Julian. He didn't choose to leave you. He chose to leave me, and I chose to keep you entirely for myself. The silence that followed wasn't angry. It was heavy with the realization of two lives shaped by a single secret. Julian didn't explode. He simply looked at the watch, then at his mother's tired, beautiful face. I spent my life hating a shadow, Julian said. Now I have to figure out how to fight a man who looks exactly like me. The Sunday morning air in Atlanta was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and the distant rhythmic peal of church bells. Dae-seong stood across the street from the Haven, leaning against the cold metal of his rental car. He looked out of place in his tailored navy suit, a stark contrast to the families walking past him in their Sunday best, bright linens, wide-brimmed hats, and children with polished shoes. He had spent the night staring at lines of code and falsified reports, his eyes burning from the glow of the screen and the weight of his own secrets. He saw Diane arrive. She was wearing a cream-colored dress that caught the morning light, her hair pinned back in a soft, elegant twist. She stopped at the bottom of the steps to greet an elderly man, her laughter carrying across the pavement. He expected her to ignore him. He expected her to call the police, or worse, Julian. Instead, she looked across the street, locked eyes with him, and did the one thing he wasn't prepared for. She walked toward him. "You look like a man who hasn't slept since the 90s, Dae-seong," she said softly as she reached the curb. "The time difference," he lied, his voice gravelly, "it catches up to you." Diane looked at him, her gaze lingering on the dark circles beneath his eyes. There was no malice in her expression, only a quiet, unnerving grace. "We're having a service inside. It's not a boardroom, and there are no contracts to sign, but there's a seat in the back if you want to sit down for an hour. You look like you've been running for 30 years. "Diane, I'm the man trying to take this building," he reminded her, his chest tightening. "Why would you invite me in?" "Because," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "the man I knew in Seoul used to love the quiet of the temple. I think that man is still in there, buried under all that expensive wool. Come in, Dae-seong, just for an hour." The interior of the Haven had been transformed. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows, and a small band, a keyboard, a bass, and a drum kit, was playing a soulful, low-tempo melody. The room was packed with the people Dae-seong was supposed to displace, the single mothers, the elderly, the students. He slipped into the very last row, trying to make himself invisible. Up front, Julian sat with his arms crossed, his sharp eyes scanning the room until they landed on Dae-seong. The young lawyer's jaw tightened, but a subtle hand signal from Diane kept him in his seat. Then the music swelled. A woman with a voice like honey and thunder began to sing a song about mercy. Dae-seong didn't know the lyrics, but the vibration of the sound hit him in the solar plexus. It felt like the walls of his heart, reinforced by 30 years of corporate warfare, were beginning to sweat. A gray-haired pastor stepped to the wooden lectern. He didn't open a laptop. He opened a worn, leather-bound book. "Today," the pastor began, his voice filling every corner of the room, "we talk about the things we've lost. We talk about the locusts." Dae-seong stiffened. "In the book of Joel, chapter 2, verse 25, the Lord makes a promise that defies human logic. He says, 'I will restore to you the years that the swarming locust has eaten.'" The pastor leaned forward, his eyes seemingly searching out Dae-seong in the back row. "Now, the locust doesn't just take your grain. It takes your time. It takes your seasons. Many of you feel like the best parts of your life were eaten away by bad decisions, by tragedy, or by people who didn't love you the way they should have. You look at the calendar and you say, 'It's too late. The years are gone. The field is bare.'" Dae-seong felt a hot, sharp pressure behind his eyes. The locusts. He thought of the years he had spent in a loveless marriage, the 30 years he had spent building a tower of gold while his son was growing up in a different world, the 30 years he had believed a lie because it was easier than fighting his mother. His life was a magnificent, glittering field that had been picked clean. He was a billionaire who owned nothing but regrets. "But God doesn't say he will give you new years," the pastor thundered. "He says he will restore the years that were eaten. He can pack the joy of 30 years into a single afternoon. He can take a heart that has been a desert for 3 decades and make it bloom in a second season." Diane was sitting in the front row, but she turned her head just enough to see him. Dae-seong's breath hitched. A single, hot tear escaped and tracked down his cheek, followed by another. He didn't wipe them away. The chairman was gone. The rebel was gone. There was only a man, shattered by the realization that he had been starving in a palace. He lowered his head into his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. He wasn't crying for the building. He wasn't crying for the company. He was crying for the 10,950 days he had spent without the woman in the cream dress and the son with the Omega watch. In the back of a humble community center in Atlanta, the most powerful man in Seoul finally surrendered. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't just fix the project. He had to burn his empire to the ground to save his soul. The flight from Atlanta to Seoul took 16 hours, but for Han Dae-seong, it felt like a descent into a previous life. As the private jet pierced the thick layer of smog hanging over Incheon, he looked at his reflection in the darkened window. The man staring back looked the same. Sharp jaw, expensive silk tie, eyes like flint. But the engine of his soul had been rewired in a humble back pew in Georgia. He wasn't returning to lead. He was returning to execute a coup against himself. Kang Dae Global Headquarters, Seoul. The boardroom on the 88th floor was a cathedral of glass and ego. Outside, the city of Seoul stretched out like a circuit board, pulsing with the electricity of 1,000,000,000,000. Inside, the air was freezing. Chairwoman Kang sat at the head of the obsidian table, her silver hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to sharpen her features. The 12 board members sat in predatory silence, their eyes fixed on Dae-seong as he entered. "You are late, Dae-seong," his mother said, her voice a dry rattle. "Director Park has already prepared the papers for the Atlanta demolition. The contractors are on standby. Sign them, and let us put this difficult tenant behind us." Dae-seong didn't sit. He walked to the head of the table, standing opposite his mother. He looked at the faces of the men who had helped him build an empire on the broken dreams of others. "There will be no demolition," Dae-seong said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of an avalanche. The room went unnervingly still. "The Atlanta project is canceled," he continued, placing a black flash drive on the table, "and I have spent the last 48 hours compiling the records of how this acquisition was handled. Not just in Georgia, but the land grabs in Vietnam, the shell companies in the Caymans, and the bribery of the Atlanta Zoning Board." Chairwoman Kang's eyes narrowed into slits. "You are speaking of your own legacy, Dae-seong. You are part of this." "I was," he admitted, and for the first time in 30 years, he smiled, a sad, liberating expression. "But the locusts have finished their meal, Mother. I'm done being one of them." He hit a key on his remote. The massive wall-mounted screen flickered to life, displaying a series of internal emails and bank transfers. The sabotage he had performed in Atlanta wasn't just to buy time. It was to build a cage. "If this project moves forward," Dae-seong said, looking each board member in the eye, "this data goes to the Financial Supervisory Service and the international press. Every one of you will be trading your Italian suits for prison jumpsuits." "You would destroy the company to save a shack in the woods?" Director Park hissed. "You would ruin us for a woman?" "I would ruin you to save my soul," Dae-seong replied. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He slid it across the obsidian table toward his mother. "My formal resignation, effective immediately. I am forfeiting my voting shares, my title, and my primary holdings. I'm divesting my personal wealth into a blind trust to be managed for community development, specifically to fund the Haven in perpetuity." Chairwoman Kang stood up, her face contorting with a rage that transcended corporate interest. It was the fury of a woman losing her grip on a puppet she had pulled the strings of for half a century. "You will be a nobody, Dae-seong," she shrieked. "You will have nothing. No car, no title, no name. You are walking out of this tower into the dirt." Dae-seong adjusted his cufflinks one last time. He thought of Julian's face, the son who had his eyes but his mother's heart. He thought of the way Diane looked in the morning light, a woman who had nothing by his mother's standards, but possessed a peace he had never been able to buy. "The dirt is where things grow, Mother," he said softly. "I've lived in the sky long enough. It's too cold up here." He walked out of the boardroom. He didn't take the executive elevator. He walked past his shocked secretary, past the marble statues, and out through the glass revolving doors of the lobby. The afternoon sun hit him, and for the first time in 30 years, the air didn't feel heavy. He hailed a taxi, not a black luxury car, but a common cab. As the driver pulled away from the tower that bore his name, Daeshong looked back. The building was a monument to a man who no longer existed. He had burnt the bridge. He had sacrificed his empire to protect the woman he had wronged and the son he had missed. He had fallen from the height of power, but as he reached into his pocket and felt the small, empty space where his corporate ID used to be, he felt lighter than air. He was a nobody. And for the first time in his life, he was free to become a man. The light in the community center was soft, the kind of amber glow that usually signaled the end of a long day. Diane was stacking chairs in the main hall, her movements slow. The news had broken that morning. Kang Day Global had officially withdrawn its bid for the Atlanta site. The Haven was safe. The neighborhood was celebrating, but Diane felt a strange, hollowed-out stillness. She heard the door creak. She didn't look up, assuming it was Julian coming back for his briefcase. "The miracle arrived, Julian," she said, her voice weary but grateful. The mountain moved. "It didn't move on its own, Diane." The voice wasn't Julian's. It was deeper, rougher, and lacked the polished edge of corporate command. Diane turned. She nearly dropped the chair in her hands. Dae-seong stood in the doorway, but he was unrecognizable. The charcoal gray suit was gone, replaced by a simple dark sweater and worn chinos. His hair, usually shellacked into place, was windblown and flecked with more silver than she had noticed before. He looked like a man who had walked a long distance. "I heard about the board meeting," she said, her voice trembling. "I heard you gave it all up." "I didn't give it up," Daeshong said, stepping into the room. He kept his distance, staying near the door as if he knew he no longer had the right to occupy her space. "I threw it away. It was a heavy coat that never fit me anyway." He looked around the room, at the posters of children's art, the flyers for community gardens, the lived-in warmth of the place. "I came to ask for something I have no right to," he whispered. He didn't look at her with the eyes of a chairman. He looked at her with the eyes of the boy from the 1996 library. "I'm not here about the building, Diane. I'm here about the years. I miss the first steps. I miss the first words. I miss the scraped knees and the graduation. I miss 30 years of being the man you deserved and the father he needed." He took a jagged breath. "I was a coward then. I let my mother tell me who I was. And because of that, Julian grew up with a ghost for a father, and you grew up with a burden you should have never carried alone. I am so sorry." Diane felt a sob rise in her throat, but she choked it back. The air between them was thick with the ghosts of 3 decades. She wanted to run to him. She wanted to scream at him. But mostly she was terrified. "You can't just walk in here and offer an apology like it's a settlement check, Dae-seong," she said, her voice rising. "Do you know how hard it was to look at his face every day and see the man who broke me? To be 50 years old and finally think I could breathe, only to have you show up and try to take my home?" She stepped toward him, her eyes fierce and wet. "I tried again, you know. When I was 45, I met a man, a good man, I thought. I let him in. I let him near Julian. And when things got hard, he walked away just like you did. He told me I was too much history, too much baggage. I decided then that I was done. I closed the door. I gave up on the idea of a partner because I couldn't survive another abandonment." Daeshong moved as if to reach for her hand, but she flinched back, her back hitting the stacks of chairs. "Diane! No!" she snapped. "You are powerful and you are bold, and you think because you resigned from your company that the debt is paid. But the debt is my heart, Daeshong, and I don't know if there's enough gold in Seoul to fix what was broken. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, her expression hardening into a mask of stoic grace. I forgive you for the building. I truly do. And I forgive you for the silence, because I see now that you were a prisoner too. My faith tells me that grace is free, and I give it to you tonight. You are forgiven. Dae-seong's face lit up with a flicker of hope, but she extinguished it with her next breath. But grace is not the same as trust, she said firmly. Grace is a gift. Trust is something you earn with time. Time you already spent. I can't do this. I can't wait for the day your mother calls or your old life whistles and you disappear again. I'm 55 years old, Dae-seong. I don't have another heartbreak left in me. She pointed toward the door. Go back to Korea. Find a way to be a man on your own. But leave us out of it. Dae-seong stood still, the rejection cutting deeper than any boardroom betrayal. He saw the wall she had built, not out of hate, but out of a desperate need to survive. I'm not going back to Korea, he said quietly. I told you, I have no home there. My home was always wherever you were. I just didn't have the directions until now. He turned to leave, his shoulders hunched. I'll stay in Atlanta. I'll be at the hotel. I'll wait, Diane. If it takes another 30 years, I'll be the man who earns that trust. As the door closed behind him, Diane sank into a chair and finally let the tears come. She had prayed for a miracle to save her center, and God had sent the one man who could destroy the peace she had fought so hard to find. The weeks following Dae-seong's resignation were a study in silent persistence. He didn't call Diane. He didn't show up at her door with flowers. Instead, he lived in a modest rental apartment in Midtown, eating takeout and spending his days in the public library, using his formidable intellect to research every legal hurdle Julian's small civil rights firm was facing. He knew Diane's heart was a fortress. If he tried to scale the walls with pity, she would only add another layer of stone. He had to show her, and their son, what he had truly walked away from. Not to brag, but to prove that they were the only empire he ever wanted. The ruse. Julian sat in his office, staring at an invitation that looked like it had been printed on sheets of silver. The Global Justice Initiative, Julian read aloud, his brow furrowed. They want to honor our firm's work on the Atlanta housing crisis? In Seoul? Diane, who was helping him organize files, felt the blood drain from her face. Seoul? It's an international gala, Ma. Full sponsorship for the firm's partners and their families. It's a networking goldmine. If I get these donors on board, the Haven never has to worry about a utility bill again. Julian looked at her, his eyes shining with the ambition of a man who wanted to protect his mother's legacy. You have to come with me. You're the reason I'm a lawyer. Diane looked at the invitation. She knew, with a mother's intuition, that this had Dae-seong's fingerprints all over it. The timing was too perfect, the location too deliberate. But as she looked at Julian, the son who had worked so hard without a father's name or a father's fortune, she couldn't say no. I'll go, she whispered. For you, Julian. The arrival? Seoul, South Korea. The Incheon International Airport of 2026 was a far cry from the terminal Diane had fled in 1996. It was a cathedral of glass, robots, and greenery. As they stepped into the arrivals hall, a chauffeur holding a sign for the Miller Party ushered them toward a sleek black electric limousine. Diane sat by the window, her hand clutching her purse. The city she remembered, the one of narrow alleys and the smell of coal briquettes, had been swallowed by a futuristic metropolis. As the car swept onto the Mapo Bridge, Julian let out a low whistle. Look at that, Ma. Dominating the skyline was a jagged, diamond-shaped skyscraper that seemed to pierce the clouds. At its summit, a massive neon logo glowed against the dusk. Kang Day. That's the company, Julian said, his voice dropping an octave. The one that tried to evict us. I looked it up on the flight. It's one of the top 5 conglomerates in the country. They own everything from ships to semiconductors. Diane looked at the tower. She thought of Dae-seong standing in her dusty community center in Georgia, wearing a simple sweater. She realized, with a jolt of vertigo, that she had seen him only as her ex-lover, not as the king of this glittering concrete jungle. The limousine pulled up to the Grand Hyatt, perched high on Namsan Mountain. Their suite overlooked the entire city. On the mahogany desk sat a single vase of white lilies, Diane's favorite, and a small handwritten note that did not bear a signature. Welcome back to the city that never forgot you. He's here, isn't he? Julian asked, standing on the balcony and looking down at the city lights. Diane joined him. He never really left, Julian. He just took his armor off. Julian turned to his mother, his expression complicated. I spent my whole life thinking my father was some deadbeat who couldn't handle the responsibility of a kid. But looking at that tower, Ma, he walked away from that. For us, I'm a lawyer. I deal in evidence. And the evidence says a man doesn't burn a kingdom down unless he thinks what's outside the walls is more valuable. Diane didn't answer. She couldn't. She was looking at the Omega watch on Julian's wrist, ticking away in the city where it was first wound. She had spent 30 years protecting her heart from the rebel heir, but she wasn't prepared for the man who had become a nobody just to stand on her level. The air on the private balcony of the Grand Hyatt was thin and cold, smelling of the distant Han River and the metallic tang of a city that never slept. Julian stood by the railing, his silhouette nearly identical to the man who had just stepped out of the glass doors behind him. Dae-seong stopped a few paces back. He didn't try to close the distance. He knew that for Julian, he wasn't just a father. He was a trespasser in a life that had been perfectly self-contained for 29 years. Your mother is resting, Dae-seong said, his voice barely rising above the hum of the city. The flight was long for her. Julian didn't turn around. He looked out at the Kangdai Tower, glowing like a monolith in the distance. It's a long way to fall, isn't it? From the top of that building to a rental apartment in Atlanta. I didn't fall, Dae-seong replied quietly. I jumped. There's a difference. Julian finally turned, his eyes as sharp as a scalpel. He was wearing the Omega watch, the silver face catching the light. Why now? You had 30 years. You had private investigators, satellites, and enough money to buy the moon. Don't tell me you couldn't find her. I was told she took a payoff, Dae-seong said, the words tasting like ash. My mother showed me a receipt. She made me believe your mother was a woman who put a price on our love. I was a fool, Julian. I chose to believe the lie because it was easier than fighting a war I thought I'd already lost. Julian stepped closer, his thumb instinctively hooking under his jaw, a mirror image of the man standing before him. And what about me? You didn't know about me, but the moment you walked into the Haven, you knew. I saw it in your eyes. You looked at me like you'd seen a ghost. I looked at you, Dae-seong corrected, his voice trembling for the first time. And I saw the only good thing I ever did in this world, a thing I didn't even know I had done. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound book, the journals he had kept during his exile in the corporate world. He held it out, but Julian didn't take it. I'm a lawyer, Mr. Han, Julian said, his voice dripping with the protective cynicism he'd built to shield his mother. I deal in evidence. You want to be my father? That's a title that carries 29 years of back pay and scraped knees, broken hearts, and bills my mother worked 3 jobs to pay. You don't get to walk in and claim the throne just because you burned your castle down. Dae-seong bowed his head. I don't want a throne, Julian. I want to be the man who stands behind the man you've become. I missed the chance to be your hero when you were 5. Let me be your ally now that you're 29 years old. Julian looked at Daeseong's hands. They were shaking. The powerful chairman, the lion of soul, was vibrating with the terror of a man being judged by his own blood. "My mother is the strongest person I know," Julian said, his voice softening just a fraction. "She spent 29 years making sure I never felt like half a person. If you hurt her again, if you waver, if your mother calls and you flinch, I will destroy whatever is left of your name. Do you understand?" "I would expect nothing less from my son," Daeseong said, a ghost of a proud smile touching his lips. Julian looked back at the city, then down at his watch. He didn't call him father. Not yet. But he didn't walk away either. "The tea in the suite is terrible," Julian remarked dryly, the sharp edge of his tongue returning. "If you really want to show me soul, find me a place that serves a decent drink, somewhere that isn't owned by a conglomerate." Daeseong felt a surge of hope so violent it nearly brought him to his knees. He stepped up to the railing, standing shoulder to shoulder with the man who was his living legacy. "I know a place," Daeseong said. "It's in an alleyway. It hasn't changed in 30 years. As they stood there, two men with the same habit and the same heart, the shadow on the wall, finally began to take the shape of a family. The night of the gala. Daeseong stood in the shadows of the hotel ballroom's mezzanine, watching the entrance. He wasn't the host. He had funneled the money through a shell foundation to ensure Julian wouldn't feel like a charity case. When the doors opened, his heart stopped. Diane entered, wearing a floor-length charcoal silk gown that moved like water. She looked like royalty, not the kind that was born into it, but the kind that had survived a war and won. Beside her, Julian stood tall, his chin-rubbing habit in full effect as he navigated the sea of photographers and philanthropists. Daeseong gripped the railing. He had lured them here to show them the world they belonged to, but seeing them there, he realized he didn't want the world. He just wanted to be the one who got to hold her hand as she walked through it. He began to walk down the stairs, his heart hammering against his ribs. It was time to stop being a ghost and start being a man who fought for his family. The Seoul night was a kaleidoscope of neon and ancient stone, but for Diane, the only thing that felt real was the weight of Daeseong's gaze. After the gala, as the elite of the city filtered out into their waiting cars, Daeseong didn't send a driver. He stood at the base of the Grand Hyatt's marble stairs, holding a coat. Not his, but a soft cashmere wrap he had purchased because he remembered how she always shivered when the dew settled. "Julian is with the organizers," Daeseong said, his voice a low, steady thrum against the backdrop of the city's roar. "He's safe, and he's happy. Give me 3 hours, Diane. Not as a chairman, not as a donor, just as a man who wants to show you the world we almost had." Diane hesitated, her hand hovering over her throat. "We aren't those kids anymore, Daeseong." "No," he said, stepping closer, his presence commanding and intentional. "We are better. We know the cost of the silence now." He took her to Sinchon. In 1996, it had been a sprawl of student bars and cramped bookshops where they had hidden from his family's security teams. Now, it was a sleek district of high-end boutiques and glass-fronted cafes. He led her down a narrow, winding alleyway that seemed to have escaped the march of progress. At the end stood a traditional hanok, Korean house, that had been meticulously restored. "The old library where we met," Daeseong whispered. "It was restored and turned into a private archive." Inside, the scent of old paper and cedarwood enveloped them. Daeseong moved with a quiet domestic grace that shocked her. Diane sat on a silk cushion, her feet aching from the hours in gala heels. She let out a soft, involuntary wince as she tried to adjust her position. Without a word, Daeseong knelt before her. "What are you doing?" she gasped, trying to pull her feet back. "You've spent 30 years standing on your own, Diane," he said, his hands, strong, warm, and steady, firmly but gently taking hold of her ankles. He removed her shoes and placed her feet on a heated stone stool. For one night, let someone else carry the weight. He began to massage the tension from her arches with a focus that was almost primal. There was no ego in the gesture. This was the boldness of a man who had realized that true power wasn't in commanding thousands, but in the ability to cherish one. The intimacy was staggering. At 20, passion is a fire that burns fast and bright. At 50, it was a deep subterranean heat, a slow-burning coal that had survived a winter of 30 years. As his thumbs traced the lines of her skin, Diane felt a terrifyingly beautiful surge of emotion. It wasn't just physical. It was the recognition of a man who saw her, not as a mother, not as a leader, but as the woman he had never stopped mourning. Later, they walked toward the Han River, the same path they had taken on the night they were parted. As they entered a section of the park where the streetlights had flickered out, Diane slowed, her breath hitching. Her fear of the dark, a remnant of a childhood trauma she had once whispered to him in the dark of a 1996 dorm room, flared up. Daeshong didn't hesitate. He stepped behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her back against his chest. He was a solid, unbreakable wall of warmth. "I am the light now, Diane," he murmured into her hair. "The shadows don't get to have you anymore, not as long as I'm drawing breath." He turned her around in the darkness. The intensity in his eyes was fierce, a hunger that was both protective and possessive. He didn't ask for permission. He leaned down and pressed his forehead against hers. "I am going to spend every day making you forget why you ever had to be strong," he vowed. "I'm going to make you fall for me again, not because of what I had, but because of who I am when I am with you." Diane looked up at him, her heart finally beginning to crack open. She saw the man who had been willing to become nobody to protect her everything. She realized that love after 50 wasn't a compromise. It was a triumph. "Dae-seong," she whispered, her hands finally coming up to rest on his shoulders. "Don't say it's too late," he commanded softly, his lips inches from hers. "The years the locusts ate are being returned. Let them be returned, Diane." When he finally kissed her, it wasn't the tentative kiss of a youth. It was the kiss of a man reclaiming his soul. It was intense, beautiful, and deeply intentional. A promise signed in the dark of soul that he was never, ever letting go again. The Blue Diamond Ballroom of the Shilla Hotel was a sea of black ties, jade jewelry, and the suffocating scent of lilies. This was the territory of the Lotus Foundation Benefit, the most prestigious event on the Seoul social calendar, and it was the domain of Chairwoman Kang. Diane felt like a splash of ink on a pristine silk canvas. Though her gown was elegant, she knew that every eye in the room was dissecting her. She was the American, the foreigner, the difficult tenant who had brought the mighty Han Dae-seong to his knees. As she stood near a marble pillar, the crowd parted like the Red Sea. Chairwoman Kang approached, her footsteps silent on the thick carpet, her presence radiating a frigid, calculated power. Behind her, several photographers hovered, their lenses hungry for a scandal. "Miss Miller," the chairwoman said, her voice loud enough to carry across the hushed room. She spoke in perfect clipped English. "It is curious to see you here. I imagine the community centers in Georgia are quite different from refined society. Did you find a dress that didn't come from a donation bin?" A ripple of cruel, suppressed titters moved through the nearby socialites. "Mother, that is enough," a voice rang out. Daeshong stepped out of the shadows. He wasn't wearing the Kang Dai corporate pin on his lapel. He walked straight to Diane, not stopping until he was at her side. He didn't just stand near her. He placed his hand firmly on the small of her back, a gesture of absolute possession and protection. You speak of refinement, Daeshong said, his voice resonating with a power that silenced the room. He looked at the photographers, then back at his mother. But there is nothing refined about cruelty. You see a tenant, you see a stranger. He turned Diane to face the crowd, his eyes shining with a fierce, unapologetic light. I want to be very clear for the record. This woman is the heartbeat of my life. She is the woman I loved 30 years ago, and she is the only woman I have ever truly loved. If I am nobody now, it is because being her partner is a higher title than chairman could ever be. The flashes went off like a storm of lightning. The scandal wasn't Diane. It was Dai Seong's total public defection from the Han family's cold prestige. Chairwoman Kang's face turned a ghostly ashen white. She turned her venomous gaze toward Julian, who was standing a few feet away, his jaw set in that familiar, stubborn line. And you, she hissed, her voice dropping to a low, lethal poison. You think you can walk into this city and claim a piece of a legacy that doesn't belong to you? You are a mistake born in a library. You have no name here. Julian stepped forward. He didn't look at the cameras. He looked directly into the Ice Queen's eyes. I don't want your name, Julian said, his voice calm but heavy with the weight of his mother's grace. I've spent 29 years being proud of the name Miller. But you're wrong about one thing. He turned his head toward Dae-seong. For a second, the lawyer's sharp exterior crumbled, revealing the boy who had wondered for 3 decades who his father was. My father, Julian said, the word hitting the room like a physical blow, didn't choose a legacy. He chose us, and that makes him more of a man than anyone in this room of statues. Dae-seong's breath hitched, the word father, spoken for the first time, in the heat of battle, was the restoration he had been promised in that back pew in Atlanta. It was the 10,950 days of lost time being condensed into a single miraculous second. The chairwoman, defeated by a love she couldn't quantify or buy, turned her back and retreated into the crowd, her empire of ice finally beginning to melt under the heat of their united front. Dae-seong, Diane, and Julian walked out of the gala together, ignoring the shouting reporters. They stepped out into the crisp Seoul night, the air tasting of freedom. Dae-seong turned to Diane as they reached the car. He looked exhausted, but his eyes were clear. I'm sorry she did that. I'm sorry it's always a fight. Diane looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the man who had lost his fortune, his title, and his mother's favor in the span of a month. She saw the man who had stood in front of the world and claimed a woman from a small community center as his queen. She realized then that her fear of him leaving was a ghost from a past that no longer existed. He hadn't just visited her world. He had burned his own down so he could never go back. He wasn't the rebel heir anymore. He was hers. You have nowhere else to go, do you? She whispered, her hands finding his. Nowhere, he promised, leaning his forehead against hers. You are my home, Diane. I've been a refugee for 30 years. Please, don't send me back out into the cold. Diane pulled him into a kiss that tasted of tears and the second bloom she never thought she'd find. At 55, she wasn't just safe, she was cherished. The final night in Seoul didn't taste like the bitter rain of 1996. It tasted of wood smoke, expensive tea, and the crisp, clean air that follows a long overdue storm. Dae-seong led Diane to the private rooftop garden of their hotel. Below them, Seoul was a tapestry of light, a million lives pulsing in the dark. The Kangdae Tower stood in the distance, but it no longer looked like a throne. It looked like a tomb he had successfully escaped. Diane leaned against the glass railing, her cashmere wrap fluttering in the breeze. She felt light. For 30 years, she had been a fortress, a single mother, a protector. For the first time, she felt like a woman who was simply wanted. Dae-seong stepped into her space. He didn't have the heavy, polished armor of the chairman. He looked younger, the lines of his face softened by a peace he had never known. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, but he didn't open it immediately. He took her hand, his thumb tracing the pulse at her wrist. "I spent 3 decades thinking I was building a kingdom," he said, his voice a low, resonant hum. "But when I stood in your center in Atlanta, I realized I was just a man standing in the ruins of his own heart. I let the locusts eat the best of us, Diane. I let them take our youth, our firsts, and the sound of our sons' laughter." He knelt. There was no hesitation in his movements, no concern for the dignity of a former CEO. "I am 56 years old. I have no title, and I have given away the fortune that kept me a prisoner, but I have a soul that belongs to you." He opened the box. Inside was a ring, a vintage-style band with a deep, radiant sapphire, the color of the midnight sky they had shared in their youth. "I lost 30 years, Diane. I won't lose another day. I won't lose another sunset. Will you let me spend the rest of my breath proving that our second season is more beautiful than our first?" Diane's eyes filled with tears, not of grief, but of a profound, overwhelming relief. She looked down at him and saw the man who had been willing to become nobody, just to be her someone. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Yes, Daeseong." The wedding wasn't held in a cathedral or a ballroom. It was held in the restored Hanok Library in Sinchon, the place where a Fulbright scholar and a rebel heir had first shared a book of poetry. It was an intimate, vibrant collision of cultures. Diane walked down the aisle in a gown of ivory silk, but her veil was pinned with a traditional Korean binyo, a silver hairpiece given to her by Daeseong. Beside her, Julian stood tall, his eyes bright with pride as he gave his mother away to the man he now called father. Daeseong wore a modern hanbok of deep midnight blue. When they exchanged vows, they did so in both English and Korean, a bridge of language built over a chasm of lost time. There were no board members, no photographers, just the people who loved them, the staff from the Haven who had flown in from Atlanta, and the few friends Daeseong had reclaimed from his previous life. When they were pronounced husband and wife, the applause wasn't polite. It was a roar of victory 1 year later. Atlanta, Georgia. The Haven had grown. With the blind trust Daeseong had established, the center had expanded into the adjacent lot. It was now a sprawling campus of education, art, and refuge. Diane sat on the new garden terrace, watching a group of children play on the lawn. She looked at her hands, one wearing the sapphire ring, the other holding a cup of tea. She felt a profound sense of restoration. The years the locust had eaten hadn't just been replaced, they had been redeemed. Daeseong walked out of the center's new legacy wing, where he spent his afternoons mentoring young entrepreneurs and teaching Korean language classes to neighborhood kids. He was dressed in a simple linen shirt, his sleeves rolled up, looking every bit the man she loved. He sat beside her, naturally pulling her into his side. "Julian just called," Daeseong said, a smile tugging at his lips. "He won the injunction for the East Side project. He's celebrating by bringing over dinner. He asked if you wanted the spicy chicken or the mild." Diane laughed, leaning her head on his shoulder. "He knows I like the spice, even if it makes me cry." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the sun dip below the Atlanta skyline. At 56 and 57, they weren't at the end of their story. They were in the most intense, vibrant chapter of it. "You were right," Diane whispered, watching her husband rub his chin in that familiar, thoughtful way. "Love at our age. It's not a sunset, is it?" Daeseong kissed her temple, his grip on her hand tightening. "No, my love, it's the second bloom, and the fruit is always sweeter when you've survived the winter." The Haven was full. Their son was thriving, and in the quiet of a Georgia evening, Two people who had lost 30 years realized they had found something even better, a love that knew how to stay. The end. Thank you for watching. If you love this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more emotional twists and character-driven plots. And if you're ready for the next story, make sure to turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Until next time, keep believing in love that defies all odds.